This is going to be a really interesting session, and as I pointed out in some of the sessions yesterday, you might think that it's me here that's going to be doing all of the work. It isn't. It's you. We really want to make this an interactive session. We really want to ask our panelists to tell us as much as they possibly can. They may disagree with each other. They may have different points of view. You may have different points of view, and that's what this session is all about, just exploring the ideas. It's why we call it Idea Swap. Let's start, though, having a look at perhaps the background research. I'm going to start with Anastasia first, simply because you've been doing a lot of research, and I think that's mainly or chiefly how you've been spending your time in recent times. You work in big data sets, and you work in financial services, and you've worked for financial services. This is an area, I think, where big data security is a major issue, given that big data or data generally needs to be shared, but it also needs to be protected. So what sort of research have you uncovered, and what are some of the conclusions you've uncovered in the financial services sector, particularly when it comes to researching how you use big data?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everybody for attending this session. It has been a joy so far, a lot of interesting information. So as a researcher, I do work a lot in financial sector, especially dealing with digital data, digital channels of delivering financial services. And what I find really interesting is that big data analytics is really invasive. And we saw two presentations thus far where the analysis is done on a lot of behavior that if we were asked for permission to disclose, that we probably wouldn't. But big data analytics allows us to look into that. So when we come to financial services, it's become really tricky where on one hand we want to expand the services and include as many people as possible and deliver the services to them. And that comes not only to financial services but retail as well. On the other hand, we don't want to breach the line of privacy where they will block us out and prevent us from doing any additional research. There are a lot of really interesting developments that are happening in financial industry thus far. I'm not sure if any of you are aware of mobile money that is booming currently in Africa. The decentralized currencies such as Bitcoin, mobile banking, a lot of data coming in, a lot of analysis. Because of this data, in 2015 we have 300 million people who are using financial services who wouldn't be using otherwise. They're using through mobile banking, mobile money. We want them to use the money, and we want them to give us more opportunities to service them with other financial services, but we don't want to breach privacy. What I found really interesting in some of our research, when we directly ask people if they have a chance to get a loan to open a business, would they consider private information be so private that it would prevent it from disclosing to a financial service provider and getting a larger loan? And the majority would consider the most private information they would never tell anybody to be their medical conditions. So when it comes to financial history, when it comes to their financial behavior, they're even willing to disclose the amount of savings they have in a hiding place in their house to get a bigger loan, to get more opportunities. So dealing with big data analytics, asking for disclosing private data is about showing people value-added services. What kind of value can we provide by doing this analysis? What kind of benefit the person who is disclosing private information can receive from disclosing this information? On the other hand, we also deal quite a bit with big data analytics being a very, very expensive undertaking. As you saw from Frederick's presentation, big data analytics starts at the very bottom, where you have to do millions of observations to come up with one really important pattern that will lead you to discovering this teenager pregnancy before the father knew about that, before anybody else knew. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of analysis, it's a lot of work, it's extremely expensive. So the value added has to be on the provider side as well. So basically, this is the essence of big data. The value added has to be on both sides, and both sides has to agree what's private, what is not, and how disclosing private information, how putting the consumer at risk can bring more and more benefits to both sides of the transaction.
Akram, you're dealing with consumers on a daily basis, so when it comes to starting with data mining or data collection and then processing that data so that the company can better perform later on, what sort of security devices do you put in place to satisfy the customer that their information is secure?
So basically, as an organization that predominantly dependent on data as the main business model, which basically creates a marketplace between talent and opportunity, and at the same time, an organization that operate within the online space with all the data that gets generated through the interaction between the users and the website or the services, online services. The opportunity of capturing data, analyzing data, and effectively using it to service the various stakeholders, whether it's our users, our employers, or even other businesses, including our internal team who analyze what we need to offer in terms of services, offers, and products, makes it quite important for us to think of data from the beginning. And in doing so, we knew from the start that with the advancements of technologies in terms of storage and memory that made big data a reality today, we needed to be very careful not to start halfway and stop, because there's the biggest challenges to big data security. It's one of two. First of all, when you treat your data at the different levels of sensitivity. So usually most of us who operate production environments, you treat that data with a lot of, you put all the security procedures, guidelines, and teams that are able to support you on that front. But there's a lot of silos of data that gets generated through the operation. And previously, when there were no big data, let's say, initiatives, these silos of information were not really protected the same way that a production environment is protected. That's one thing. And we knew that this is something we need to be very careful with, specifically that with the availability of storage, keeping this data was quite easy as a decision. The second thing is that if you attempt to start a program of collecting this data without knowing exactly what you need to do with it, you have to be very careful that you're currently adding even more depth and width to the footprint of this information that makes it much more appealing to potential misuse. So the kind of procedures that we've basically applied is effectively making sure that we treat all of our data, whether it's generated at the production environment or it's like at the tangent machines or even from different sources that we interact with, at the same level of security that we treat our production environment. We made sure that the pathway of the data during transit or during storage is completely secured with the right procedures, with the right guidelines and governance, and that's just to answer this particular.
So you've implemented a very strong layer of governance over the pathway of data, so that you can both protect the flow, because you have a massive flow of data from the public, which you would then analyze, I would imagine, to then retarget when it comes to your consumer targeting the product. Is that how it works?
That's true. That's true.
Sammar, when we're looking at Al-Tayer Group, it's another company, of course, where you have lots of internal communications, which is data in no other certain terms. And also you have consumer data as well. And you have a third level, really, which is a sales requirement using all of that data that you're bringing in. So how does the governance work when it comes to both collecting the data, analyzing the data, and then turning that into intelligence for your business?
The governance aspect relates to enablement. It's not so much about structuring what may be a traditional heavyweight model to restrict access to data, but rather enable data and information to the right decision makers in a timely fashion. And the most critical thing is that data has a half-life. It pops up, it exists, a consumer transacts, and then we need to act on that information in a particular time frame to put it in the hands of the right people. Be it buying, be it trends, be it marketing, be it communication, be it advertising, sharing that information with our suppliers and partners. That data only has value for a short amount of time, typically. If you're going to extrapolate from that and put it into your BI and big data analytical tools, that is the next level down in terms of how can you mine that information to generate genuine value for your business. So the governance structures that we put around information is about enabling the key users to make decisions.
Chris and I were talking earlier, and he said that it's really small data as opposed to big data. And I suppose in some aspect it is, but then at the same time, data is data, regardless of the label that you put on there. And data collection is really something that you're all involved with, especially you. It's television ratings, but it's the mechanism of how you collect the data is one thing, but what you do with the data, how you process the data, and how you use that for corporate intelligence, it's pretty much the same regardless of the collection process. So how would you say that you would differ or be the same in to other organizations when it comes to collection of tangible data and turning that into useful information?
I think one of the fundamental differences between media and other organizations or other sectors is, first of all, we're dealing with measurement rather than marketing. I think that's a very important distinction, because with measurement, you've got to be very, very precise about what you do. With marketing, you're happy if you get an 80% chance that you're going to hit your target or whatever it is. With measurement, we have to be very, very exact about how many people are watching and so on. So that's an important distinction. I think the other key thing, and this was touched on in one of the questions to David earlier, and interesting, I think it came from a lady from NBC, is that media consumption, certainly in mass media consumption, is a very, very, people still regard that as a very private thing. And it's not something that's transactional. It's not something where they log on. There's 50, 60 years of established cultural behavior of people sitting in their living rooms or their bedrooms or wherever they are and consuming that media, and they are not generally prepared to give up a lot of detail about what they do, and we see a lot of resistance when it comes to trying to acquire that information, because they just fundamentally don't regard it as something where giving up their privacy is part of the bargain.
But the information that you're collecting, if I just carry on for this for a moment, does eventually go to the sales and marketing department. Sure. So I remember the old days of guesstimating television viewership based on demographics, and a rough estimate of which demographic would have the highest spend and which of that demographic with the high spend would buy certain products based on their socio-economic grouping and so on and so forth. Is any of that old-fashioned measurement still used in the modern-day techniques of gathering the information?
That is pretty much still how we do it in media advertising. The holy grail for media advertising is to try to link that old-fashioned, this is the TV ratings, to can you then link that to say, okay, a person who watches Game of Thrones or Adat Muhammad or whatever the program is, also is more likely to look at these websites, is more likely to consume these products. The difficulty there is that media measurement panels tend to be fairly small. So if you've got a panel of, say, 3,000 people, that's fine when you're talking about 15 to 20 channels that they're likely to watch. It becomes much more difficult when you try to measure that behavior across a very fragmented online system. And so at the moment, what people are doing is taking big data sets from online measurement, big data sets from perhaps consumer measurement, and trying to fuse that data with the small data sets that they get from people like us. Perhaps in a future, we will get to a single thing, and that's certainly what the industry is working towards. But nobody's come up with the solution yet.
It seems that educated assumptions based on information is still reasonably accurate if it's protracted out of that. But let me come back to Anastasia while we're on the subject then of looking at new products that might be able to facilitate what you're talking about. With what Chris is saying, do you see there a time when we can implement some sort of new device or some sort of new mechanism to be able to help organizations like Chris to delve a little bit more deeply into the realities of what that information means, generally speaking?
First, when I was listening to Chris, I was thinking that the issue of privacy is very much context grounded, because we're dealing with a thing as simple as what channels do you watch, and people tend to be extremely private about sharing this information. In my research, I'm dealing with questions of, have you defaulted on a loan recently? And people are willing to share that. And I think this difference in willingness to share private information comes from, do you see the end gain for you after you share it? So if I share which channels I watch, I know there will be probably more advertisement on those channels. So I'm not really interested in sharing that much so I can watch my movies uninterrupted. Whereas when we're talking about financial services, if I can get a big loan, I'll open my business, I'll make a lot of money. So what that they know that I have some black marks in my history. I think this is a really interesting issue that's emerging with the rise of the big data. But going back to measurement, one of the companies I'm currently consulting is dealing with, is actually a media company that works in Nairobi and targets young Kenyans and young Tanzanians through a number of digital channels. And the situation in Africa is such that they made a huge leap going right over all traditional media, so basically from traditional radio with the batteries, skipping the whole generations of TV, typical broadband internet, right into TV and everything else on their mobile phone. So when we look at Africa, it might seem really out of the stereotype, but they really are in that period right now where internet is everything. Everything is internet, and internet is all things. So there are a lot of innovations in terms of measuring audiences that are happening in Africa currently that might be eventually useful for organizations like Chris' organization, where measurement is streamed through the internet, and there are a lot of tools that we're applying to make sure we know what young people are watching at every single time, what they are talking about, how they are talking about that, and what can be most useful in terms of intervening into this stream of conversations among young people to make a difference and to introduce products, to introduce services to them that might be beneficial to them and help retailers enter this market of audience that will be the next generation of big buyers.
But let's ask the question now about the role of legislation. Should there be tougher legislation, or should there be legislation where there isn't any in different parts of the world, such as ours, to police a little bit more definedly about the flow of data and how data is being used? I'm going to open this to the panel. Please come in and speak when you would like to. Who wants to go first?
So first of all, I would like to maybe differentiate between two things. There's like the privacy of data, which is specific pieces of information that gets captured within a business. Hello? Yep. So I would like to just create, basically a basic differentiation between the privacy of data and the security of data. And I think when we've tackled the first question, we've talked about it as if it's under single umbrella, because the privacy of data is a function of the provider as well that interacted with the service, in addition to my intention of keeping that privacy controlled from a business perspective, because I would like to benefit, let's say, from that data, but as well is the other measures of security that I would put into place to protect the big data as a whole that might not have private information. So that's basically the main differentiation here. The reality is, when we look at the regulations that are in place or attempted to be in place there, most of them has been driven by the EU and the UK through some of the privacy watchdogs. There's a lot of activities that happened after that. Most of this maybe in 2012. The US has a Bill of Rights for privacy, but it's much more lenient, let's say. And this is understood as most of the businesses that are making use of the data is also in the US and has a lot of pressure on that point. In our region, I imagine that there's some kind of a fragmentation of how do we look at it. In Dubai in particular, there are certain components of regulations that are in place in the IFC and within the healthcare sector, but it doesn't really cover all sorts of data. Honestly, this is a big subject currently. I listened to Wikipedia founder when he thought that the rights to forget your information as deeply immoral, and when Google uses certain techniques that more of a window dressing just to suit the compliance to comply with certain regulations, let's say in Europe. That tells me clearly that there's no conviction that how do we capture this data, how do we basically market as as private or not. Certain privacy is already exchanged as a currency in the way that users basically give their information through mobile, I agree, click, which happens almost without thinking. So trying to draw a line now needs a lot of a lot of studies, specifically that there is an impedance mismatch between the speed that the technology is moving with and the services are moving with, and at the same time the way that it would take to put regulations and enforce them. So that's, let's say, our perspective on the subject.
You're right. It is a big subject, and we could delve a lot more deeply into that. Let me ask Sammar for a comment on that.
One important philosophical debate is simply the notion of privacy and how that's evolved with the generational shift, millennials in particular, and not to caricature, but obviously younger people are more comfortable with sharing data and have a different notion of privacy. What does it mean to be private? If I enroll myself in a Wi-Fi in a mall or in a hotel or wherever else, and I choose to do it with a social login, just log in here with your Facebook account, log in here with your Google+. I'm immediately giving that provider access to my information, and generally people doing that are comfortable with that. Probably what they're not so much aware of is the big data capability on the back of that within microseconds, that information is now available to categorize you, to access your preferences, and to start cross-selling and reselling and upselling, etc., which some people are comfortable with and some are not. So the notion of privacy itself is one that's in flux. In the UK in particular, I think is a very good test market for this as well, with the Information Commissioner's Office introducing guidance for big data. Traditional legislation refers to data protection, but now you're talking about how do people access silos of information that perhaps previously were not connected. So people make available on Facebook, for example, LinkedIn, public information. That's available to third parties to access and aggregate as they wish. Facebook and LinkedIn might be storing your information in a secure manner in compliance with data protection legislation. However, the third party taking that information, potentially to another jurisdiction, and doing all sorts of things with it, aggregating it, analyzing it, cutting it, slicing it, dicing it, and possibly not securing it in a manner that's compliant to how those original providers put it in place, now creates a whole new headache. So it becomes a challenge to legislate and control where information is moving from and to, which jurisdiction is it transmitting to and from, and what are the individual's rights and indeed expectations of privacy in that movement of information.
One of the subjects that came out from a previous conference was about just that very subject, and it is an entirely separate subject, isn't it? Really, because even if you're applying to join an information collecting service, or if you're downloading an app, or any of those activities, there's often a compliance that you must sign to agree. And within that compliance, there are mechanisms to give permissions for certain organizations to extract data and use that for purposes which you're agreeing to give to them, whatever that might be. So that's perhaps where legislation might start, but if we go deeply into that, we'll miss out on some of the other things, but perhaps that is a place we could start. Would you say, Chris, I mean, is that an area that affects the work that you do, or isn't it a question that's raised at all about security?
Maybe regulation is part of the answer, but I think there is a real need for government involvement, whether it's through regulation or assurance or whatever you want to call it, to ensure that people trust the fact that when they give over this data, that it is being dealt with the right way. And I think what we see, because we're going literally into people's homes to install measurement devices in their homes, so we are getting, you know, real face-to-face feedback about the concerns that people have about their privacy. And they are very concerned about, you know, how this will be used, you know, how it will be shared, what the security is. They're very concerned about, you know, even giving out details about the people in their house. You've got issues with different demographics here. You've got, you know, a guy living in a shared villa in, you know, Sharjah or Ajman. He's worried about, you know, the fact that he's not actually supposed to be doing that, so he's giving us their information. You've got people who are watching illegal channels, or, you know, from Dish TV or things like that. And there is generally a lack of trust in the population, I think, that their data is being handled the right way. So, you know, that's where I would like to see, as I say, whether it's regulation or whatever, I think that's where official involvement needs to be concentrated.
So at the moment, we're relying on trust, we're relying on self-governance, we're relying on organizations to be more morally in tune with the people they're collecting data from and the people they're targeting. Let's have a look at hackers. How are we looking to protect our data from outside influences such as hackers? Is that something that you see as a major problem, or is it something that we can protect against perhaps a little bit more easily than we might have thought? Maybe I'll ask Anastasia first of all.
We do look at privacy and protecting private information from the provider perspective. However, as Akram and Sammar mentioned, there are a lot of people who are very comfortable sharing a lot. And part of it comes from, yes, we are really comfortable, but part of it comes from just lack of understanding of the consequences. And as Steve earlier mentioned also, there are a lot of disclaimers where people have to agree to something and click the button before they proceed. Nobody reads them. So I think part of the policing or part of the governance and regulation should come in a form of actively educating the customers, just telling them what it means. Not just telling them how the information will be used, but also if you're sharing this information, these are the consequences. We can protect you from them, but it's not 100% guaranteed. We can guarantee 95%. And then you can make an educated choice of whether or not you keep sharing it. We had a lot of cases quite recently in US and in Europe where you can see that people shared some pictures when they were in high school on Facebook. And then when they tried to apply for their first job, their future employers went to the Facebook and saw some pictures that were not appropriate. So they were not granted jobs, they were not given diplomas. So there is a lack of understanding what this oversharing means. And I think it's up for Facebook, for Byte, for any other provider of the services that require sharing private information to actively tell people what does it mean if you share this information. Going back to hackers, just really quickly, I think the same big data analytics that we're using to track customer journey can be used to protect customers from hackers. Because hackerism is pattern of activities that is also unusual. So if we know our consumers, we know generally 90% of their behavior patterns. If something happens that is outside of their typical behavior, that's probably something that's not done by them, done by hackers. For example, when I work with big banks in US, They send me alerts. They tell me, hey, Anastasia, we see this activity that is really outside your typical pattern of withdrawing and payments that you use your debit card for. Is it your activity? So it's the same approach of looking at your customers and really understanding their behavior, really understanding what they do, for what purposes, where and how, and then noting any unusual behavior that might signal the breaches in privacy.
And we have an audience question now from back here.
My question is basically how will open data, specifically in Dubai, will affect the war on privatism, the era of hacktivism, and most importantly, that invisible I agree box that everyone tends to click while ignoring the terms and conditions. Will that have any effect on those three typical areas?
Certainly, of course, there'll be an impact. I suppose the question is for a commercial provider or decision maker is, how do you anticipate what those impacts may be? And how do you put in the flexibility in your own structures to manage such a change or transition? So one important aspect around this is informed consent and communicating and having an open conversation with your customers and suppliers about data and what does it mean. So certainly legislation and structures will evolve, but building the trust fundamentally is critical with your customers and suppliers. They're happy to share their information. It's only used for this purpose. It is appropriately secured and segregated in your environments. And increasingly, where you are internally in your organization using cloud services, you have the right relationships, and those are fully secured as well. So when it comes to accepting open data or transacting on any such platform where you're going to have those touch points, you are confident that your front-end and back-end organization are talking to each other, and the governance is in place to manage that.
I think one of the important things that dealing with information and getting government to provide freedom of information will add to everybody who's dealing with data in this part of the world is, at the moment, we really do have a lot of trouble getting reliable official data. Can anybody here tell me what the proportions of nationalities are in the UAE? You can't, because there are no official statistics. I'm sure somebody knows it, but you can't get it. So to my mind, it's partly about how consumers are protected, absolutely, but it's also about actually getting a bit more from the official sources. I think is a great pointer in that direction.
If we drive from the previous initiatives that happened, let's say elsewhere, I doubt that there will be any major private information that is there inside this kind of data feeds. The benefits of using something like that to create more dimensions and build much better understanding of what's happening in a specific geography is tremendous. And I think these initiatives, on the contrary, would create more value into most of the initiatives that whether the private sector or the public sector is actually conducting. So honestly, I don't see any major issues that might be arising from the openness of that data. Specifically, that's in general, you don't find much of private information disclosed into this. So that's our take on it.
Just a quick comment regarding the data. I think the official data have a lot of information that covers a lot of fields, even privacy, the distribution of population, etc. But it is not the area where we have to discuss now. I'm going back to privacy. What I learned from the panel discussion that we are talking about sandland definition, that privacy is not the same as it was in 1980s or after 10 years and in the coming years. So this is what sort of procedures, laws, measures that we can put here in force that will maintain privacy in that one. So there is a doubt about this process. And why I'm saying that there will be a trade-off. What is private or privacy between under this umbrella in UAE may not be the same in other country. What is in this nation or another, it is also different, and from time to time for many reasons. And the other dimension is when you have privacy on the individual level, And if I am free to send everything on the Facebook or Instagram, etc., because this is the case, may not be officially by the state is allowed. So you will have a country privacy and you have individual privacy, and the need to have a value added from the disclosure of data is to have individual characteristics, to have a business case. So what sort of trade-off that we need? I think either we have to go to official statistics to determine the border of privacy and maintain it, because without that then we'll be talking about sandland, or the business community should as soon as possible come to us and say this is what we mean by privacy, and keep it vague as we are dealing at now. I think you are misleading us, and thank you.
Now, a few years ago I was advising the health ministry in the UK. One of the programs we were dealing with was the patient record system for the National Health Service, which, as you know, is a huge source of data. The challenge then was to digitize that information and put it onto a patient record information system. However, the fundamental tenet of that was not the challenge around the architecture or the security or the interconnectivity between the systems that would provision that information to clinicians. It was about getting consent from the individuals themselves, that this is your private medical record you may have held on a paper-based file for decades with the same medical practice. Are you comfortable that that data is now digitized and passed on? And in many instances, the result of the exercise showed that many people rejected that. No, they regard that information as private. I don't want it shared, extrapolated, or researched in any manner. So one of the fundamental lessons learned is that the customer or the owner of that data is the stakeholder of that. They ultimately are the guardians and decide what it is private to me and what it is that I'm willing to share. And so because that's a variable, it varies between person to person and culture to culture, as my colleague touched upon, it becomes a very difficult problem to just put a standard layer over the top of it. Rather, it's more of an opt-in, opt-out model to say, what do you regard as the individual that I wish to share and I'm happy to open up? There's obviously going to be a minimum that most people can agree upon, such as name or address or age or whatever. Again, some people may simply object to that much. But if we can agree on a bare minimum that forms the fundamental of, yes, this is my identifier, this is perhaps my Emirates ID number or whatever it is, yes, fine, I'm happy to disclose that. Above and beyond that, no, this is what I regard as private. So the opt-in, opt-out model is crucial. And sometimes you can be taken by surprise of what people are thinking they're happy to share or not share.
Akram, you would agree with that, I think. Or disagree. Akram, you would agree with that, I think.
No, actually I agree, and I would like to also maybe get back to Anastasia's point, is that there's a lot of education that needs to happen around that area. And effectively, when you're interacting with a web service and you're disclosing some private information, you're already contracting with that service based on a certain legal structure, and you're giving that information willingly. So that's the first thing. But you might not be educated about what you have just done. What are the implications of it? And this is something I think needs to be instilled in, let's say, media and in programs within a specific government. I think also the question raised another point, which is the way you would convey that message, that private information. It might be okay for you as an individual. Maybe at a state level, they're not comfortable when there's a good amount of their users had actually conveyed some pattern of maybe certain attention to a certain program or even what they like or what they dislike about something. So I understand the complexity around that area, and I think it's, governments always have the rights, and sometimes they do that, where if they feel that there's really national security or a specific challenge on that front, they could really discontinue the service or make sure that people are not reaching to those services. And this happens every now and then, and we hear about it in the news. So the mechanics that is currently in place takes into consideration all of that, the education, the legal structure, and also the the one-off kind of situations that might arise every now and then. So that's...
I agree with all of the speakers, but I also think the beauty of the big data is that it allows for enormous collaboration across different industries, across different organizations, across different stakeholders. And the stakeholders are ultimately the customers, ultimately the people, however, businesses as well, and the governments. So I think there should be a layered approach where the customers have to say what they consider private data or not. However, businesses then have to come in and make an intelligent decision as to at which level, which additional data should be considered private before it's shared widely. And then the government should be also involved as the ultimate oversight as to what is happening in the countries. So as a researcher, I'm a big fan of open data, and we do actively participate in big data movement. However, when we share data with other participants, other stakeholders in financial services, for example, we make sure that certain elements are excluded from the data sets because we made a promise to our consumers that we will keep their privacy to our best understanding what privacy means.
Again, that's a moral, it's a moral stand, isn't it, to know how far things do go before you legislate.
It's not just a matter of education, there's a trade-off. You know, privacy is a commodity. Privacy has a value, and businesses have to show the consumer what value they're going to get from giving up their privacy, and they will give up a bit of it. You know, we pay our panelists on a monthly basis for the privilege of getting their private information. And I think more businesses have to think that, you know, getting private information or getting consumer information is not just something that is part of the deal anymore. They have to actually show what they're providing to the consumer to get that information.
It would be great to continue this conversation, because as we're getting into the subject of data hugging, as it was described yesterday, that happens at various levels of data collection and data usage. And there is a fear factor, isn't there, at almost every level about how much data to release. And what are the safeguards if the data is released or shared? And what are the safeguards between interdepartmental organizations, or even between individuals, or even, as we pointed out yesterday and we carried on today from this question, in certain professions like medical and finances, where the data is very, very sensitive.
Thank you. My name's Nelio. I'm from South Africa. I think the governance models are already there. So when I arrived in Dubai, I didn't have to consent to giving anyone my credit card other than putting my PIN in to be able to transact during a financial transaction. The possibility of doing that, say if I got hit by a car, I don't have my medical or my health details with me. The governance models should look to extend to facilitating global facilitation. When I arrived here, Google didn't ask me for any information around my Google account. I was still able to transact on my phone with all my Google information. I think governance should be looking to facilitate human flow across borders to allow easy access to information when it's needed. If that's the case, would government play a key role in facilitating that?
Who'd like to start answering that question?
I think it's a very interesting topic in the sense that if you think about data as the new oil, and you're saying, can I apply a free trade model to that? The same vested interests come into play, and you'll see on the geopolitical scene, certain countries have taken an objection to that. They're erecting their own firewalls. They are legislating against cloud providers hosting data outside their borders. They don't want data held on their citizens by another third party that may be owned or registered overseas. So free trade, yes, in physical goods. Free trade in data. I think that governments are catching up. No doubt you'll see that becoming more and more of a central theme discussed at G7 and Davos, et cetera, where how do you enable this? And again, you'll have, I think, the traditional conflicts between different competing entities around should it flow or shouldn't it. Because ultimately, that data can be monetized, used for competitive advantage, or used for political advantage. And that is, I think you'll find different state actors taking different positions on that. You've seen as well recently in the US the rollback of the Patriot Act, which has been replaced by the Freedom Act, which, again, checks and balances, the mood changes and swings. But ultimately, one of the consequences of the last 10 years of the regime there has been the pushback against cloud for US-based services. They found it difficult to sell their data center capacity outside the North American region for that reason, that the legislative environment was not suiting customers coming in from outside. Now that may change, so the conversation may also change.